I'm getting to the point where I hate switching streams. Uh, we miss you, kid. Uh, go ahead and bring our guest in here. Let her get ready. She's finishing up the final makeup, making everything look good. There we go. Are you ready? All right. Hey, Steph, how are you doing? Welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. I'm doing all right. It's kind of a hay fever day.
Okay. We've been fighting a technical issue with you. Have you got everything straightened out, or is it?
Well, so far as I know, the headset that I had, the brand new headset that I had that I started using last night, stopped working. So
okay, let's move that thing up out of my way.
Yeah.
I was hiding behind the microphone.
So,
but your new headset quit?
Yeah, my new headset quit. So I'm back to using the laptop's mic and speakers, and I hope I sound okay. So.
Okay, yeah, you sound pretty good. If you want to go ahead and start sharing up your screen like you did for your other presentation, and also did a little research, and I know I did a little research. There it is. No, that's your website. Where is it? You sent it to. I made the ticker and everything. Okay. Well, once you get started, I'll change that up to give the link to your presentation that you're giving right now.
Okay.
And also, you are now broadcasting on your Stephanie Osborn page.
All right.
So all your fans can tune in and watch. The Osborn Cosmic Report.
Yes.
Okay. And we'll add this up to the stream. Let you get that up to full screen. And I'm going to drop out of here and try to get that straightened out. And we got John sort of monitoring too. If you need any help or something goes awry, just holler at one of us and we'll jump back in here and straighten it up.
All right. Sounds good.
All right.
And once again, folks, if I can, if you got questions, post them in the comments block, and hopefully somebody will be available to read them to me so I can answer, because all I can see on my screen is my slideshow. Now, this here is one of the main reasons that I got interested in geology. I have a graduate subspecialty in geology and an undergraduate minor in geology, but in all honesty, that minor is more than a minor. I could have gone, had I decided, I could have gone for about another year and had an additional degree in geology. I just decided I needed to move on because otherwise I was going to be a perennial student, satisfying my own curiosity, and I figured I needed to actually get done and get a job, So anyway, I grew up outside Clarksville, Tennessee. That's in northwestern Middle Tennessee. It's on the line, the state line between Tennessee and Kentucky, and we were close enough to the New Madrid Fault that whenever it went off, we felt it. I cannot begin to tell you the number of times we would be sitting at the dinner table as a family and everybody and just chatting away, and everybody just suddenly stop and look at each other like, what just happened? And we'd glance up and the hanging lamp would be swaying, or the water in the glasses would be rippling. And we'd realize, well, we just had a quake. We had quite a large one when I was little. And it actually, it was a Saturday morning. I remember it very clearly. It was a Saturday morning. I was sitting in an armchair watching cartoons on TV. And it was violent enough to nearly throw me out of the armchair. So I became aware of these things at an early age, and I got interested in them, and I started studying them on my own. And then when I got to college, I started studying them for seriously with professors. And I thought it would be interesting, since this is a major fault system in the United States, and very few people know anything about it. So I put together a talk, and once again, like I was telling you yesterday, I wound up making an ebook out of it, and there's a whole lot more information in the ebook than I can put in a talk. So that's the cover on the right, and Joe Dog is going to be hopefully shortly scrolling the purchase link for it and for yesterday's ebook that I turned the talk into.
It is active now, Stephanie.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe.
All right.
So let's get started here. Now, the New Madrid Fault Zone is a large area in the central U.S., roughly along the Mississippi River, central Mississippi. And it consists of a couple of main faults and numerous secondary faults, as well as some other structures. Back in the winter of 1811-1812, it produced a titanic series of severe quakes, and it is still active. It has a danger level possibly exceeding that of the San Andreas Fault, which is a plate boundary, but it is much less well known. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about this fault. I'm going to introduce you to some terminology for this particular science of seismology, and which is really a subspecialty of geology. And we're going to talk about how this thing formed. We're going to talk about the historic series of quakes in 1811-1812. And we're going to talk about why nobody knows about this and what it's capable of doing. So, there are principally three types of geologic structures found in the fault zone region. There are primary normal faults. There are several. There is at least one primary reverse fault, which is known as the real foot fault. And there are numerous secondary faults, basically cracks that form when the primaries release. And there are several Graben and Horst structures. Yes, I'm going to explain what all of those are. We're going to define those. Okay. There are three principal kinds of faults. They depend on the direction of movement of the fault blocks on either side of the actual fault. The fault itself is basically a plane. If you go back to geometry, it is a plane. And so this plane, therefore, defines two blocks of stone, one on each side of it. Now, since it's very rare for a fault to be exactly vertical, it's going to be at an angle. So the block on top of the fault is called the hanging wall. The block underneath is called the footwall. So on the right, we have a series of diagrams. The top diagram, the block on the right is the hanging wall, and the block on the left is the footwall. Okay? So if it is defined as a normal fault, that means that when the fault becomes active, the hanging wall has a tendency to obey gravity and slip downward. So on a normal fault, the hanging wall will always fall down. On a reverse fault, which is the second picture on the right from the top, you have we've kind of reversed things, and the hanging wall is now on the left and the footwall is on the right. A reverse fault is sometimes called a thrust fault because that's exactly what's happening. The hanging wall is being pushed thrust upward. Then in the third diagram, we have something called a strike-slip fault. Now, in this particular diagram, it's showing a vertical fault, but that's rarely the case. But in any case, with a strike-slip fault, the blocks are not moving up or down; they're moving horizontally. One is moving past the other, so it's moving like this. And then sometimes, well, more often than not, what we really have in the real world is called an oblique fault. An oblique fault combines motion of the strike slip and either a reverse or normal fault. So it's moving at an angle. So, you know, one is moving. Let's say you're standing on one block facing the other one. One is moving sideways and either up or down at the same time. So that's the real world situation. They're almost always oblique. Although occasionally you can readily define either a reverse or normal fault. Interestingly enough, the San Andreas is principally a strike-slip fault. That's because the two plates are moving past each other. So, do I have any questions at this point? Is everybody understanding that? Because this is a very key concept to what's coming next.
No questions so far have been posted.
Okay, good deal. Now, a couple other things I should note is that a normal fault is only possible when the rock strata are under tension. They're being pulled apart. A thrust fault is only possible when the blocks are being forced together and one of them slips upward. So tension and compression are the operative words. If a thrust fault is under extreme angle, it is sometimes called an overthrust fault. Most subduction zones, like off the Pacific Northwest, those are overthrust faults. Onward. Now, I thought I would show you what they look like in the real world. On the left, we have a normal fault. You'll see the fault itself is that slightly orangey jagged line running from the top left to the bottom right, near where the guy is standing. And you'll note that there is a relatively thin, pale gray stratum that has been broken. So the foot wall is the block on the left, and the hanging wall is the block on the right. And we see that gray stratum, pale gray stratum, on the right has slipped down by a significant amount. This is a normal fault. On the right, we have some interestingly colored rocks. I figured the green is probably a serpentine. But you'll notice that once again we have a diagonal fault from upper left to bottom right. And the left-hand side of the screen is the foot wall. The right-hand side is the hanging wall. And that funky multi-gray and red stratum on the right has been shoved upward. This is a reverse fault. This means that the blocks are being pushed together and the block on the right slipped upward because of the angle of the fault. Now, grabens and horsts are fault block mountains and valleys. They're formed when normal faults result in alternating uplifted and downdropped blocks of stone. And you can see on the left, I've got that diagrammed for you. The hanging walls have slipped downward relative to the foot walls. And so the foot walls become the mountains, the horsts, and the hanging walls become the valleys or grabens. Usually this is because the entire area is under tension, and this causes the blocks to spread apart a little bit and enabling alternate blocks to slip downward. Once in a while, you get a situation where you have consecutive blocks slipping downward. So it kind of stair steps a little bit, if you understand what I'm trying to say there. But for the most part, it tends to form like the diagram on the right. Now, one of the things that we do know is that the new Madrid Fault Zone has at least one major graben, and there may be as many as 4 or 5 radiating from a central stress point. This on the left is an example of a small scale graben. You can see the hanging, the triangle shaped hanging wall in the middle and 2 foot walls on either side, and you can see by the strata that the hanging wall has dropped down. And then you want to see it on a big scale where you actually are talking mountains and valleys. That's what it looks like on the right. Sometimes they're actually dropped down a lot more than that, so that you do truly get a fairly deep valley. When I'm doing this in person, I'm usually standing up and pointing at the screen, or else I've got a laser pointer and I'm pointing at it. So not being able to do that is, I keep trying to do stuff with my hands and y'all can't, never mind.
Miss Osborn, I do have a slight solution for you. We can see your mouse cursor on the screen.
Oh, really?
Yes, so if you want to point with your mouse cursor, feel free.
Okay, all right. That's I did not realize that would be visible. Okay. So here's your the stratum that most clearly evidences that it has been dropped, and so you see, but this up here also indicates that it's been dropped. But then here we have a valley in between 2 plateaus. It looks like we might have another graben over here, but you can see quite clearly that this stratum here has been dropped down to here, and this is all the way down here. Yes, there has been some distortion of it in the dropping. That's not uncommon. In something this large, it's going to be a fairly decent drop. So there's going to be some tendency of the hanging wall to collapse a little bit. All right. Now, a few other things that we're going to need to talk about if we're going to talk about how this thing formed is the concept of a pluton. It's named for Pluto, the god of the underworld. A pluton is a magma intrusion into existing rock, and it can take numerous shapes. I have them outlined for you on the left. I have them diagrammed for you on the right. A batholith is a big, huge intrusion, big blob of magma that gets forced into the rock. They are typically failed volcanic chambers because the magma never reaches the surface. You can think of them as a giant bubble of magma. Laccoliths are large bubbles, usually inserted horizontally between existing rock strata. So they tend to form lens-like shapes, or what's called lenticular. Sills are kind of like that, but they're typically smaller, and they usually follow a horizontal fault or crack. A lot of times they'll insert themselves between rock strata. So you've got these layers of rock, and so you have multiple layers of rock, and then you'll have magma come in and force its way in between. A dike is a narrow vertical intrusion coming upward, usually following a vertical crack or fault. They're often very long, and when they were originally discovered, they were originally mistaken for ancient walls. Because when they outcrop, that's generally what they look like. The softer surrounding rock will be eroded away and leave the vertical solidified magma. This is a very well-known example of a batholith. This is Half Dome at Yosemite. It's a granite batholith pluton that was sheared in two during one of the Ice Age periods, during some extensive glaciation, and it was first brought to the surface and exposed because of uplift and erosion as the mountains were being formed. So you had the uplift, followed by the erosion to expose it, followed by the glaciation that sheared off the other half of the rock. And yeah, you know what? Ice really is that strong. So, what does all this have to do with the New Madrid Fault Zone? Quite a good bit, so let's talk about the underlying geology of the zone. And to do that, we have to talk about the history of the geology. Now, everybody's familiar with plate tectonics. Basically, what it amounts to is that the plates of the crust are floating on the mantle like ice cubes in a bowl of water. But the mantle is hot. The mantle is getting heat from the core, which is hotter still. And so it develops convection. It develops convection currents. So you get upwelling heat, hits the bottom of the crust, cools and spreads out. Someplace else it cools off enough that it starts to sink back down. So you get these circular motions, and the plates ride along on those circular motions on the top of them. And so over the geologic ages, as these pieces float around, occasionally they slam into each other and stick. And numerous supercontinents have been formed and then later ripped apart. It turns out that as soon as a supercontinent forms, it has sowed the seeds of its own destruction, because it insulates the mantle underneath, and so the hot mantle begins to build up underneath, and it forms a hot spot, and it wants to come up and spread out and come up and spread out, and so it tends to buckle the crust above it, crack it, and then break it apart. Now, about 1 billion years ago, a supercontinent formed, and geologists call it Rodinia. It's the very earliest supercontinent that we can confirm. There were probably others, but because of the weathering and erosion factors and the fact that Earth is really good at recycling itself, it's hard sometimes to get the evidence for something that's very far back, because it's not there anymore. It gets recycled. Now, there's a lot of, during the research that I did for this, I found a lot of different maps for what Rodinia would have looked like and how the various continental plates were assembled. So apparently there's a lot of debate about exactly how the puzzle pieces all fit into place. But what we do know is that roughly in the middle was a plate that geologists called Laurentia. And Laurentia was the majority of what we now call North America. So it formed about 1 billion years ago, but about 750 million years ago, Rodinia began to rip apart. Now, like I was just saying, as soon as one of these supercontinents forms, it has sowed the seeds of its own destruction. So a hotspot developed in a mantle underneath Rodinia, and it was a plume of magma, hot magma, coming up, hitting the plate, and spreading apart. I don't know if y'all can see what I'm trying to do with my hands. And so this produced an upward force as well as an outward force. So it tended to crack apart the continent and generate kind of a conveyor belt to carry them all away from each other.
Just a quick interruption here. Chris Walker asked, is this before Pangea?
Yes.
Yes.
This is the earliest supercontinent that we know for sure existed. And you know, you look at it and you realize that they've named the oceans. You know, they give these plates names, and so for those of you that are into world building, I figure this is where the world builders went. All right, so as the mantle plume injected magma under the supercontinent, stressing it, cracking it, breaking it apart, quake activity and subsequent volcanic activity ramped up significantly. Dikes and sills began to form. You had volcanic eruptions. You had super volcanic eruptions. All of this stuff was going on as the continent broke up. If you want an example of what I'm talking about, go to the Great Rift Valley in Africa. That's what's happening over there right now. The plate is ripping open. Now, it turns out that the volcanic diamond fields in Arkansas are in a good spot for where all this was going on. So I actually, in the course of doing research for this, I started digging to see if maybe that was actually part of it. And I still don't know for sure. I think, based on the research that I did, that it's too young. But I'm still studying the information, trying to find out. That said, even if it is too young, it was probably made possible because of all of the faulting that was going on at the time of the breakup. So, one way or another, the Crater of Diamonds State Park in Arkansas does relate to this breakup of Rodinia. Now, gradually Rodinia breaks apart. The new continents move away from each other. You'll see that Laurentia is still here more or less in the center. You wind up with, there's East Antarctica, there's Amazonia and West Africa, Baltica. This is basically Europe here. Here's Siberia, here's northern China, here's South China way on up here. So things moved around a lot. And Laurentia being at the center of the action, and the hotspot essentially being more or less under it, was put under tremendous stress, and it was being pulled from multiple directions. So you have South China and Australia and East Antarctica, the Congo, the Kalahari, India are all moving off to the west. You have West Africa, Amazonia, and the Rio Plata moving off to the south. Baltica, North China, and Siberia moving off to the east. So they're all pulling away, and there's friction resistance pulling on Laurentia. Laurentia begins to tear apart. Now, there are multiple rifting areas that have formed in what is now the North American plate due to supercontinent breakups. You have the Mid-Continent or Keweenawen Rift, you have the Grenville Front Tectonic Zone, and you have the Reelfoot Rift. We think, like I said earlier, we don't have sure evidence of any supercontinents earlier than Laurentia. That said, we've got some really good computer models, and so they think that there were other supercontinents. And one of those was called Columbia. And they believe that the Keweenawen Rift probably formed during the breakup of Columbia. The Grenville Front Tectonic Zone, when it was active, it actually helped shape the Appalachians. For what it's worth, the Appalachian chain that we have now is Appalachians 2.0. The first Appalachian chain basically eroded all the way down, and then it rebuilt. Now, the Reelfoot Rift is the particular tear that we're interested in today. Notice that I am not equating it to the New Madrid Fault, because it's not. It's much bigger than that. There are actually two seismic zones, more or less contiguous, that are affiliated with the Reelfoot Rift. It is not believed that the Keweenawan and the Reelfoot Rifts ever connected, because they formed at different times, radically different times, geologically speaking. Only the New Madrid and the Wabash Valley seismic zones connect because they are part of the Reelfoot Rift, so they formed at the same time. There's actually another structure that we'll get to talking about that also formed at the same time and is sort of affiliated with it. But for now, let's talk about the New Madrid. The main graben basically runs right down the Mississippi River Central Valley. The northeast end runs from roughly the land between the lakes, National Recreation Area, all the way up to the Shawnee National Forest. That marks this end up here. And then the graben runs all the way down. So these are two parallel faults, okay? So the graben runs all the way down to somewhere in the Mariana to Searcy, Arkansas area, possibly as far as the Arkansas-Louisiana state line. So this here, these two parallel faults form the principal graben. But like I said earlier, there's more than one graben. And this is what it looks like. So here's the graben that we were just talking about. Then you also have the Rough Creek graben extending east into Kentucky, the southern Indiana arm going up almost as far as Indianapolis, and then the St. Louis arm that goes out to the northwest past St. Louis. So basically, this area up here is the Wabash Valley seismic zone, and this area down here is the New Madrid seismic zone. Here's New Madrid, Missouri, kind of almost in the middle of it. Any questions so far?
Other than Chris Walker's asking about, was this before Pangea? There have been no other questions.
Okay, is everybody understanding this well? Am I making sense to everybody?
Yes, you're making sense, and we got 11 people watching, so that's a good sign. And well, that's bigger than normal HallowCon panels anyway. But yeah, everything's good, sounding good.
All right.
And it's absolute to me. This is more fascinating than the one yesterday.
Okay, good. Well, I mean, it's a little closer to home.
Yeah.
I used to live in Dyersburg. So,
okay.
So yeah, I've seen the road signs do this. You know.
Yeah. All right.
All right. I'm gonna jump back out of here.
Okay.
Me too.
So, this is a I guess you could call it sort of a seismic map of both the New Madrid and the Wabash Valley seismic zones. So you have the Wabash Valley up here and the New Madrid down here. And you'll see all the red dots? Those are earthquake epicenters. So you'll notice that particularly in the New Madrid seismic zone, you'll notice that the earthquakes do a pretty good job of outlining three major faults there. Also, pleased to note how many states are directly and indirectly affected. You've got 7 states directly affected and another 4 states indirectly affected. And that includes Alabama, where I'm sitting right now. So, hey, it's going to get interesting. Now, not everybody agrees that the disintegration of Rodinia caused the rift. You know, we got into the argument yesterday about not everybody agrees that the impact was the cause of the dinosaur extinction. So scientists argue, like most people. And so there are other theories. One theory is a possible mantle hotspot. There's really not much difference between that and the disintegration of Rodinia. It's just an argument as to whether or not there was a supercontinent there or not. Another theory is that you've got residual stresses being released from the Laurentid ice sheet at the end of the last ice age when it melted. You got the rebound of the plate from the weight. Hang on just a minute. Somewhere down here. My husband's going to try and troubleshoot the headset. Then you've got another theory is that the Farallon slab had something to do with it. Now, what the heck is the Farallon slab? Well, the Farallon plate used to be the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It has almost completely subducted under the North American plate. There are a few bits and pieces still out there, notably the Juan de Fuca plate. This is just off the Pacific Northwest coast. The Cascadia subduction zone was the principal means of eating up the Farallon slab. It's virtually entirely subducted beneath us. But it has at least mostly remained a cohesive body. If we actually do a kind of seismic tomography, we can find the remnants of the plate underneath us. The back end of the slab is now located almost directly under the New Madrid. The majority of the slab is actually under the east coast. I wonder why it won't work in this. Okay. He plugged it into his phone and it works. So let me see if the headset will work now, y'all. I have to find the port. All right, talk to me, folks. Can I let me know if I can
Can you
hear
hear me now?
you
Hello?
hear me now?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I'm. Yay! It works.
Yay.
Can y'all hear
Okay.
me?
We hear you fine.
All right. Okay. Evidently, I went the wrong way with the volume on it. Okay. So the Farallon plate is under us, and so since it would kind of tend to buck up the North American plate because of just the sheer volume of basically eating up an entire plate, that's a concept for what may have formed the rift. It's become notorious relatively recently because it has been accused of feeding the Yellowstone supervolcano. But it's nowhere near the magma chamber and vent. And the big hullabaloo was, oh my gosh, it's because it's seafloor bottom and there's going to be a lot of carbonates from the limestone coral plankton. And so if it were feeding Yellowstone when Yellowstone erupted, it would have released tons and tons and tons of carbon, and it would cause an ecological disaster. And I'm like, guys, Yellowstone eruption would do that anyway. Doesn't need any assistance. Yeah. So anyway, it was kind of stupid. But there was a big hullabaloo and hue and cry. So oh well. Now, the evidence for long-term quake activity along the New Madrid system is mixed, oddly enough. If you look at the local topography and compare it to the uplift rates, That would tend to argue for a young fault zone, well less than a million years old. But there haven't been any events to even cause the rift in such a young time frame. This is something that, if it's young enough that if it had actually happened in that time frame, there would have been humans in the area to witness it. So the conclusion is therefore that the rift was indeed created during the Rodinia breakup, and so seismic activity must be intermittent along it. Tree ring growth patently, obviously, depicts the 1811 and 1812 quake series, but does not show anything prior to that, back to as early as 1682 in one location and 1321 in another. That said, objects have been inadvertently buried in the sand when a quake would occur. Anything from pottery to napped blades or arrowheads, things like that, tools. And these can be both type dated and carbon dated. And so as a result of these objects, we know that there were massive quakes in 1450, around about 900 AD, and around about 300 AD. There's other geological evidence to indicate major quake swarms in 2350 BC, 3500 BC, and 4800 BC. So evidently the tree ring growth doesn't always pick up on these quakes on this system. But we have established that they do occur. Now, the first quake recorded on the New Madrid system occurred on Christmas Day, 1699. It was recorded by a French missionary traveling with a group of explorers on the Mississippi River. It occurred about 1 in the afternoon, and the party was at that time ashore near what is today Memphis, Tennessee, when they experienced a brief period of ground shaking. That's about all we know about the event. I have dug and dug and dug, and unfortunately I have yet to find the actual transcript of the missionary's record, but it is on file someplace. Now, in 1811, let's set up the picture, the overall picture here. In 1811, the United States was 35 years old. The Louisiana Purchase had been made 8 years earlier. The area was extremely sparsely settled, and that mostly by Native Americans. St. Louis was relatively small, maybe 1,000 or so people. New Madrid, Missouri had a population of a whopping 200. Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana were both about a century old at that point. The Mississippi River was being navigated entirely by wooden vessels. There were no iron or steel hulls anywhere on the Mississippi River at that time. It was being navigated by canoes, dugouts, rafts, flatboats, and barges. The first paddle wheel steamboat on the Mississippi, the New Orleans, was about to make its way to the Mississippi. It was manufactured in Pittsburgh, PA, and it left Pittsburgh on the 20th of October, navigating down the Ohio to the Mississippi and thence to New Orleans. That distance was 1,100 miles. It had to stop in Louisville in November because, remember, at this point in time, the rivers were completely wild. And in places, they weren't that deep. And so there were rapids just past Louisville, and they had to wait for the rainfall, the winter rains, to come and raise the river sufficient for them to get safely over the rapids. So it was early December before it actually left Louisville. It was on the Ohio River near Owensboro, Kentucky, about 150 miles upstream of where the Ohio merges into the Mississippi. And about 200 miles from New Madrid, Missouri, when the first quake hit. It didn't reach New Orleans until 10 January of 1812. So this poor steamboat navigated the rest of the Ohio River and all of the Mississippi River from the mouth of the Ohio down during all of the quakes. There were 4 principal temblors during that historic series, which occurred during the winter, which was about the worst possible time for them to occur because of the weather. The first one was on 16 December, about 2 in the morning local time. It was magnitude 7.2 to 8.2, epicentered in northeast Arkansas. Multiple aftershocks continued roughly every 5 to 10 minutes until the next 6 hours later. So imagine you got aftershocks going off about every 5 minutes for 6 hours. Later that day, about 8:15 in the morning, you had another one of about the same size, epicentered in the same place. Some days later, 23rd January, at 9 in the morning, a magnitude 7 to 8, and this one was epicentered in the Missouri Boot Heel, a little bit further north. And then on 7 February at 4:45 in the morning, notice it likes to go off in the early morning hours. This one could have been as big as an 8.6, and this one was epicentered near New Madrid, Missouri. There were multiple smaller foreshocks and aftershocks in this big swarm of earthquakes. The whole system was rocking and rolling, hence the title of the book. Now, this will give you a little bit of an idea of what could be felt. There is something in geology called the modified Mercalli intensity scale. And it's kind of like where if you go in after a tornado and you estimate the size of the tornado based on the amount of damage. That's what the Mercalli intensity scale does. You look at the intensity of the damage, and you get an estimate for the magnitude of the quake. Anything greater than a 7, you're looking at about 600,000 square kilometers, or almost 250,000 square miles. And this is damage, people. Now I want you to look very carefully at that map. I want you to find Dalton. I want you to find Chattanooga. I want you to find Atlanta. I want you to find Huntsville, Alabama. I want you to find Nashville on that map. And I want you to stop and think. Now, this is the damage area. Okay, this is not this map does not show the felt region. The felt region composed most of the eastern half of the continent, literally from the Front Range of the Rockies east. The main quakes were felt in the Front Range. The population was scanty and it consisted mostly of mountain men, but there were reports. The main temblors rang church bells up and down the East Coast. Now, this was noticeable. This is not something that would have been ignored because church bells were at that time commonly used as a fire alarm. This was how you raised the volunteer firefighters. It was felt all the way up into Montreal, Canada, and it was felt all the way down into the Caribbean because residents of certain Caribbean islands were awakened by the nighttime quakes and ran into the streets because they didn't know what was going on. The Mississippi River and the tributaries, especially including the Ohio and the Cumberland were greatly disturbed. The Tennessee were greatly disturbed by it. Everybody's heard the reports of the Mississippi River running backwards. It sort of kind of did, but really not. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here are some eyewitness accounts. After supper, we went to sleep as usual, about 10 o'clock, and in the night I was awakened by the most tremendous noise, accompanied by an agitation of the boat so violent that it appeared in danger of upsetting. I could distinctly see the river as if agitated by a storm, and although the noise was inconceivably loud and terrific, I could distinctly hear the crash of falling trees and the screaming of the wild fowl on the river, but found that the boat was still safe at her moorings. By the time we could get to our fire, which was on a large flagstone in the stern of the boat, the shock had ceased. But immediately the perpendicular banks, both above and below us, began to fall into the river in such vast masses as nearly to sink our boat by the swell they occasioned. At daylight, we had counted 27 shocks. Now, we do not know the death toll caused by this swarm of quakes, because the habit of many that were traveling on the river was to tie up under the bluffs to be somewhat sheltered from the wind and the rain. And the bluffs collapsed, and people just went missing. And nobody knows how many died. On the 16th of December, 1811, about 2 o'clock a.m., we were visited by a violent shock of an earthquake, accompanied by a very awful noise resembling loud but distant thunder, but more hoarse and vibrating, which was followed in a few minutes by the complete saturation of the atmosphere with sulphurous vapor causing total darkness. The screams of the affrighted inhabitants running to and fro, not knowing where to go or what to do, the cries of the fowls and beasts of every species, the cracking of trees falling, and the roaring of the Mississippi, the current of which was retrograde for a few minutes, owing, as is supposed, to an eruption in its bed, formed a scene truly horrible. Now, for what it's worth, that fairly good-sized quake that I experienced as a child, here goes my cat again. I did hear the sound of the quake. I could hear it coming. It was a rumbling, and it was coming from the northwest, which, relative to where I lived, was the direction of the fault from my house. And it grew louder as it approached, and then it hit the house, and the house began to move. And I described it to my parents later. My parents were outside working on some stuff, and they were standing on the ground, so they didn't feel it as much as I did, because I was the house had a basement, so I was up a little ways. So as the house moved, I could feel it. They actually could see the house move. They made me come outside. I didn't get to see the rest of my cartoons that day because I had to stay outside where it was a little bit safer and the house wouldn't fall on me. But I described it to them as sounding like giants rolling boulders down the roof. I'm not going to go through these in great detail. I'm going to leave them up long enough for y'all to read them. I will say that there's tons of these eyewitness accounts. There were enough people in the area that there were just a lot of eyewitness accounts. One poor guy, he had a cabin near on the bank of the Mississippi River, and he had an outhouse out back. And he made it through one of these middle of the night earthquakes. And what's the first thing that we all do when we get up in the morning? We head for the bathroom, right? So he goes out the back door to head for the outhouse, only to discover that that a crack had opened up in the ground of his backyard, and the Mississippi River had diverted through it, and his outhouse was now on the far side of the Mississippi. Now, this is a letter from Alabama, present-day Jackson, Alabama, down near Mobile. Note that the shaking was felt down there. Now, the War of 1812 was about to begin. The various tribes, Indian tribes, were very restless. Some were near internal civil war and some were in full revolt. This was about the time of the Red Stick Uprising in the Creek Nation. So all of this was going on at once. You know, you got the buildup of political tensions to the War of 1812. You've got political and religious tensions going on amongst the various Native American tribes in the area, and you've got all these quakes going on. I kind of feel bad for the people in the area. Now, to give you an idea of how many eyewitness accounts, here's a selection. There's 3 pages worth of accounts on this one website, and that's just the links to the accounts. Short-term effects. Well, we talked about seismic seiches yesterday. So you know, it's a standing wave in a contained body of water. So you had seismic seiches in the rivers, and they were propagating upriver against the current. There's one primary thrust fault in this whole system of faults, and it happens to cross the Mississippi River. And so you wound up with faults going off under the Mississippi and creating temporary waterfalls. Houses were severely damaged in the area. Innumerable chimneys were toppled in St. Louis. New Madrid was virtually flattened by the shaking, and Little Prairie, Missouri was destroyed by liquefaction. What happens in liquefaction is that the sediments, the water table is disturbed. The sediments the particles wind up suspended in the water table, and the ground just turns to quicksand, and anything on top of it sinks down into it. And so a lot of times it sinks unevenly. The bottom right picture gives you an idea of the effects of liquefaction on standing structures. If the sinking is uneven, the buildings tilt or even fall over. So it was utter chaos. There are also other short-term effects, such as earthquake lights. This is a legitimate phenomenon, and it's called seismoluminescence, and it probably derives from the piezoelectric effect in quartz crystals. Occasionally, you would have warm water thrown up from the ground. I got to remember to plug this thing in before I start these things. Gotta find the plug by field. There we go. More than likely, the shaking and the compression of the earthquake waves caused the water to heat up. And then as the ground split, the pressure would force the water to squirt out of the openings. So, I mean, yeah, it gets weird. Sand boils or sand blows. This is another function of liquefaction, where the slurry of sand and water, as the compression part of the earthquake wave moves through, bursts the surface and squirts the liquefied material out the top. Here in the middle image, you've got a cross section of one of these blows. You see, this traces a fissure. This traces where a fissure occurred.
Stephanie, I'm going to jump in here to actually give you a chance to grab a drink of water real quick.
Okay.
And Carl Witzman put in 2 comments. He says this goes back to about 3:35, about 30 minutes ago. He says, doesn't sound good for Carbondale in Illinois. Glad we don't live down that far because of
Yeah, but you
Yeah.
know what? He's going to feel it just the same.
Oh yeah, everybody's going to feel it. And
Yep.
then this is the most recent one. When you're talking about liquefaction, he goes, "Yikes! Liquefaction, that word
Yeah,
is horrifying. That's
Yeah.
that's a mouthful."
yeah. And you got to remember, think of all of the sediment, the river deposited sediment in the area
Oh yeah,
that's going to liquefy. And this middle image here, if you were to take and cut away right down through the middle, this is what it would look like. Kind of looks like a volcano in miniature.
yeah.
And then occasionally these things would barf out tar balls. If you got any sort of petroleum stuff in the ground anywhere around there, it's gonna mix in with the sand and form these tarry blobs that are going to come up in the liquefaction squirt in the sand blow.
All right, I'm gonna jump back out of here.
Okay.
All right, and I'll probably give you another water break in about 15 minutes.
Okay. And
All right.
anytime anybody's got a question, go ahead and jump in.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. There's also things like earthquake smog. It turns out that that the shaking and the sand blows and things like that, they vent gases and dust into the atmosphere. There was loud thunder. This is actually likely the earthquake itself. One of the major types of earthquake waves is what's called an acoustic wave. It's a compression wave. It's a sound wave running in the rock. Now, if this compression wave is transmitted from the ground to the air, as is extremely probable to occur, it's going to produce a sound. And it's going to be deep and low frequency, and it's going to sound a lot like thunder. And like I said earlier, I've heard it myself. People reported strange behavior by animals before the earthquakes. The animals were all nervous and excited. The domestics went wild. The wild animals became tame. Snakes were coming out of hibernation, getting out of the ground. Flocks of ducks and geese were landing near people. And it's believed that they were probably... Humans can only feel a quake above about a magnitude 3. Magnitude 3 is about where we start being able to perceive them. Animals generally have a whole lot more sensitive sensory organs than we've got. It's generally thought that they are feeling the foreshocks running up to the major quake. And they understand enough to know this ain't good. And so they're reacting to it. Ground fissures. These have nothing to do with faults. They have everything to do with the ground is moving. And so if the earthquake wave buckles the ground too much, it's going to crack open. Interestingly enough, since they had more than 2,000 quakes in 5 months, they discovered that most of the crevices that were opening up, most of these fissures, ran north to south. So they started doing something, and people were falling into them. And some of them were big. Some of them were long. And some people just fell in and didn't, because when the next wave came along, the fissure might close back up. And so people were being killed falling into these fissures. So they found that if they chopped down trees so that they fell in an east to west direction, and then they would jump on the tree when a quake would hit, the tree would span any fissures that opened up under them, and they stayed safe. After the February 7th quake, boatmen reported that the Mississippi actually ran backwards for several hours. And this was because, there were several reasons. The main one in this instance was that a fissure opened up in the bed of the river, so upstream. So you actually had the water being dammed downstream, and a significant opening in the riverbed upstream, so the water was running backwards to fill the hole. And then also another thing that happened was that as the block of rock moved up downstream and dammed the river, the area near a Reelfoot Creek subsided. And so the water ran out of the banks of the Mississippi and into this subsided area. And as the earthquakes progressed, the damming of the river, the block damming the river, dropped again, and the area immediately adjacent to the river, along the river banks, rose. But so the water that had flowed into the downdropped area didn't have a way to get out. And so this is what created Reelfoot Lake. In the course of all of this, it also drowned an Indian village. It created 2 temporary waterfalls in the Mississippi. It devastated thousands of acres of forest. And there were boatmen who survived this and lived to tell the tale, provided they didn't tie up under the river bluffs to sleep at night. There were, one of the things that people used to do would be to cut down trees, large timber trees, lash them together into a raft, float down the Mississippi River to Natchez or New Orleans, sell the timber, buy whatever goods that they needed, backpack them back home along the Natchez Trace or some similar sort of pathway. And so there were many dangers. And so anything from the Creek Indian uprising, and by the way, the expression "the good Lord willing and the creeks don't rise" doesn't have anything to do with waterways. It has to do with the Creek uprising. And that basically it was a civil war in the Creek Nation, but it was bloody and it was vicious, and it occurred during this time frame. So, you know, you could set out downstream with a raft of timber and just never come back, and nobody knew if you died when the bluffs collapsed on you, or if bandits got you, or if you capsized in the river, or if the creeks got you, or what. This is Reelfoot Lake. The Reelfoot Fault is the reverse fault the thrust fault that I was telling you about. It crosses the Mississippi River in no less than 3 places. And so it thrust up, it dammed the river backed up into what is now Reelfoot Lake. The thrust reversed itself, the area by the river bank rose, and Reelfoot Lake formed. The area near the mouth of the Reelfoot River was always kind of marshy anyway, so. This is actually, of course, photography came along much later, but this is actually photography of some of the residual damage that was found in the area. The Mississippi River and the immediate area tributaries got rerouted. Peninsulas got cut off from the mainland to form islands. New islands were uplifted. Oxbow meanders got cut off. Little Prairie was wiped off the map. Reportedly, several Indian villages were also wiped out, include Tuckabatchee in Alabama, which fulfilled a prophecy by Tecumseh. So that was kind of interesting. So it just, the whole area was just in an upheaval. And this in the dead of winter. Since then, there have been a few additional quakes, notably the Halloween earthquake of 1895, which was a magnitude 6.6. 9 November 1968, this is the one that I remember. It was New Madrid, epicentered in Dale, Illinois. 18 June 2002, epicentered Evansville, Indiana, magnitude 4.6. That was on the Wabash Valley, but essentially it's all one contiguous seismic area. 18 April 2008, Evansville, Indiana, again, magnitude 5.4. And there were 2 moderate aftershocks within 3 days, a 4.6 and a 4.0. In 1974, notice how long it took them to do it. They finally installed a seismograph network in the area. And since 1974, they've detected more than 4,000 earthquakes. Most of them were too small to be felt. Typically, on average, about 1 earthquake a year is large enough to be felt, which means it's a 3.0 or greater. It's not as bad as a California quake, right? No. It turns out that they can, both the San Andreas and the New Madrid systems can produce comparable magnitude quakes. The biggest quakes range from 7 up to around 9. The San Andreas does produce them closer together every few decades versus every few centuries on the New Madrid. The length of the San Andreas fault is greater. The San Andreas is about 800 miles long. The New Madrid is about 150. But the New Madrid, as we noted earlier, affects a vastly larger area. That area affected by the 1811-1812 major quakes was 10 times larger than the area affected by the Great San Francisco quake. And it was even 2 to 3 times as large as the Great 1964 Alaska quake. One of the major differences in notoriety is that, as you can see on the right, the San Andreas is visible on the surface. The New Madrid can't be seen. The underlying geology is extremely different, and that's what makes the difference. The San Andreas is in an area of consolidated rock, which is shallow, broken, and hot. Therefore, it has what's called high energy attenuation. That means the energy damps out very quickly. The New Madrid lies under literally miles of unconsolidated waterlogged sediment. It is not visible on the surface, and unconsolidated sediment actually tends to amplify wave motion. The rocks in which the fault is found are very deep, relatively hard, very solid, not broken, and very cold. Therefore, it has low energy attenuation. The energy goes a long way before it can damp out. So the geology of the eastern U.S. is much better suited to transport earthquake energy long distances. So when's the next big one, and what can we expect? Well, geologists look for signs of earthquakes in older strata, anything from sand blows to fractures to signs of liquefaction, even tsunami deposits along bodies of water. They then date the strata using various means, and they can roughly date any objects or structures found there. And then that gives us an idea of when the earthquake would have occurred. You find enough of those to get a database, and you can start averaging the dates and determine a rough frequency of occurrence. Now, according to the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, the periodicity on the New Madrid is about one swarm, not one quake, one swarm every 500 years. And judging by the data, the quakes on this system do seem to come in swarms. Since there are multiple interconnected faults, as soon as one goes, it changes the stresses on the others, and they start to go. So you wind up with multiple things going on here. So according to Siri, we can expect a magnitude 7 or better to have a probability of 7 to 10% in the next 50 years. A magnitude 6 or better goes up to around 25 to 40% in the same time frame. A magnitude 7.7 could cause close to 100,000 injuries or deaths over 8 states, and over $300 billion in damages. FEMA estimates that a major quake at New Madrid could displace over 7 million people and destroy at least 15 major bridges. Basically, every bridge across the Mississippi River, the central Mississippi, would drop. So what do? You can prepare like you might for any natural disaster. You need to assume that the infrastructure is going to be down for a considerable time, as in several weeks. Think about what's going on in Louisiana. How long they're out with no power, no lights, no any of that. Plan for it. In 2011, we had a tornado super outbreak in the southeast, and almost all of North Alabama, about a third of the state, was without power for up to 2 weeks, because the nuclear plant over here near Decatur, all of the major lines were coming out of one end of the reactor building. And the tornado, an EF5 went through there and took out the lines. So there was no way to get power until they put all of those high tension lines back. So do not assume you'll have access to electricity. Do not assume that you will have access to other power sources, and that includes your generator, because generators require fuel. You might have fuel in the generator, but what happens when it runs out? Because it's going to be difficult to get more. So keep bottled water on hand, keep a means of filtering or purifying extant water. Keep non-perishable foodstuffs sufficient for a couple of weeks per person available. If it's in the winter, and by golly, that thing seems to have a tendency to want to go off in the winter, ensure you have a means of heating and cooking. Ensure you have sufficient fuel to do so. Ensure you have shelter against the elements, because you do not want to be in a building when a major earthquake goes. That's just a bad thing. You don't want to be under a tree. Tree might come down. If you need medications, ensure you have at least a 1-month supply on hand. And that's kind of that, folks. So let's open it up. Let's open it up to questions.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm working back channel on the next program. Is Blake available or John?
I can hop in.
Okay. If you could hop in, Blake, and help her field some questions. I'm trying to get.
Am I not sharing anymore? I hope.
You're
No, you're
fine.
not sharing
You're fine.
anymore.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Blake, if you want to come up on screen, and I'll jump out, and we'll get back to this.
Okay. I guess I'm gonna put my mug on the screen.
All right. And thank you again, Blake. Stephanie, Blake has been a lifesaver. He's helped us. He has been a big help to HallowCon in the virtual sense.
Thank
He
you
is
so
a
much.
literal help for a virtual convention.
Thank you very much, Blake.
No problem.
Much
All right.
appreciated.
A couple of these are probably way too big to fit on the screen, so I'm just going to read out to you. Chris Walker's has a statement about a show that he watched recently. I saw a show on PBS years ago talking about the Mississippi River trying to change course again. It mentioned that the new Madrid quake changed the lower channel into the lower Red River, that it was trying to change its lower channel path to the
Atchafalaya.
Atchafalaya River, and that the made pressure relief channels and dams and various other things that were done to keep it from happening again. Because if it does change course, New Orleans is doomed.
Yeah, and that's quite true. And let me tell you, and by the way, it is pronounced New Madrid. I'm not mispronouncing that.
Okay.
It's kind of like the Midwesterners name stuff after stuff in Europe and the Mediterranean, but they pronounce it different. Cairo instead of Cairo and stuff like that. But yeah, it's New Madrid. If the New Madrid goes off again, you got all those levees and everything holding the Mississippi back. Bye-bye.
They're not even levees anymore. They're just debris at that point.
They're just debris at that point. That's right, because they will crack apart in nothing flat. So yeah, it's gonna be messy when that happens. And notice I'm not saying if, I'm saying when, because it's only a matter of time. So hey.
All right. Carl Witzman, he popped up there, says, I felt a quake in Dansville around 1987 or 88, but I remember everyone was warning of the 2002 quakes. We even put tape all over our glassware in the cabinets.
Yep.
It's a threat.
It's a thing.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, those who are in the immediate vicinity of the main faults, it might be worth looking into some of the earthquake mitigation techniques that are used out in California. Things like strapping big pieces of furniture to the wall, things like that, in order to prevent things falling over on you, which is a way people get killed, depending on how big the furniture is. And even if the furniture is not big enough to kill them, sometimes it pins them down, and then when the building collapses, that kills them because they can't get loose. So it might be, yeah. Don't be afraid. Just look into it and take countermeasures. I'm not trying to scare people.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm trying to inform people.
Ruth Jackson says, so my house has a bad foundation. And that's a bad thing, isn't it? I need to get a new place.
It kind of sort of is, yeah. Now, here's what's interesting. This is also tornado central.
Mm-hmm.
This area is tornado central. And the sort of thing that you want in a tornado is not the sort of thing you want in an earthquake. A tornado, you want an underground shelter. So a lot of people use basements and things like that. But that's not the kind of foundation that works best in an earthquake. I live fairly close to the Tennessee River, so the foundations, the water table is high here. So most houses are not built with a basement sort of foundation. They either have crawl spaces or they're slab foundations. Turns out that slab foundations, which is what I have in my house, are some of the best kinds of foundations to weather an earthquake because they surf the ground waves.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's going to shear off your utilities, but your house will probably still be standing after the quake ends.
Gotcha. All right. Miss Carly has a. I was living in a trailer when the 87 or 88 quake hit. It was like my trailer was a towel and it got snapped. So just
Yeah.
this motion from
Yep.
the initial hit.
There's basically 4 kinds of earthquake waves, and they travel at slightly different speeds. And the fastest and the first wave to arrive is called a P wave, and I think it's a P wave. And it's a compression wave, and so everybody talks about the sudden punch as the earthquake arrives. That's what that is. And then you wind up with it's different polarizations of waves is what it amounts to. So you wind up with a compression wave, and then you wind up with various and sundry transverse waves. And the last one to arrive is an elliptically polarized wave. And that's the one that causes the worst damage. The others come through and they shake things up and they start putting stress fractures and stuff in the structures. And then this sucker comes through.
It's a tailwind, yeah.
And it literally stirs everything up. It's particularly bad on high rises because the high rises, as the wave propagates up through the high rise,
its frequency changes and it moves and shakes.
It's literally doing the hula.
Mm-hmm.
It's well, not literally. You know what I'm talking
just
about.
Well, in some cases,
yeah, just about because you might have the bottom of the building is moving this way, the middle of the building is moving this way, and the top of the building is moving this way.
Yeah, in 3 different axes almost.
Yeah. And so that's what really does a number on high-rise structures. Is that last quake wave to arrive? I
once, sorry about that. I have voices in my head again. I saw a video of them testing, quote simplified earthquake proofing using like a ball on a stick poked into a 2x4, and they showed the different heights that the different waves, the attenuations and stuff, cause the epicenter of the ball to do pitch, and then they were able to snap it within about 1 second, getting that vibration and that wave correct.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that all the engineers world over are now looking into. How do you correct all the different types of waves, and how do you the attenuations and such? And
it's hard. That's why the Japanese have done an awful lot of research on this, because the Japanese islands, there is a subduction zone just off the archipelago there, and that fuels, not only creates massive quakes, but it fuels the volcanoes that built the islands. And as the subducted Pacific plate melts, it rises up through the fissures and the cracks and the faults to produce volcanoes. And so they have a vested interest in figuring these things out, especially with the sizes of some of the cities that they have. And so they actually have buildings that they now build on what we would consider shock absorbers. And these things, they have, I don't know if they have 3 degrees of freedom, let alone 6, but I know they've got at least 2, because they've got roller things, so that as the ground moves like this, the building is standing on it, and there's bearings that keep the building in one
Level,
place
yep.
while the foundation moves under it.
And then what is that giant, basically counterweight that they put in the center of some of the really tall buildings called? It might just be an earthquake counterweight for all I know.
Yeah, I don't
yeah,
know, but
I've seen a couple of buildings set up like that in earthquake zones where it's like on a slab, so it floats. But the building's tall enough that when it's just one way, the counterweight's pulling the other way just slightly enough that it keeps it all in one piece.
Yeah.
So
they're working on a lot of different techniques, and some of them have been quite successful. So there is that. We are learning, and also the Japanese and I think the Chinese as well are starting to use animals as early warning systems. Because like I said earlier, the animals pick up on it. They evidently are feeling foreshocks that we can't sense.
Yeah, foreshocks and pressure waves and things like that.
So, all right, we got anything else here?
We got Chris Walker. Would cables attached to maybe concrete strips help a mobile home, like keep it together? Like, I'm assuming it's some sort of like building technique.
Actually, masonry homes fare the worst in a quake because the mortar has a tendency to spall and crack. Gotcha. So and then when the masonry falls, if you happen to be right next to it, it's going to fall on you, and that's a bad thing. Very bad thing. Title case, So wood structures are actually some of the best. As far as keeping a mobile home safe, a mobile home situated on a slab probably is pretty decent in terms of earthquakes. Cables, you could probably, I don't know about cables so much as
like actually bolting it, like an actual reinforcement, like a bolting or a like clamping of something to a stud.
Rebar, or some, yeah. Well, you want to clamp your furniture to studs, yes. Your tall furniture at least. Short stuff like couches and chairs, they're going to walk with the as the quake waves move through, but they're not. You don't have nearly as much danger of them falling on you as, say, a bookcase or an entertainment center or a china cabinet, something like that.
Something that has deadly force, vending machines, things like that. That's why vending machines are usually anchored in now.
Yes.
That was a big thing in the 70s, I know, that they weren't, and earthquakes probably killed more people than they should. So we have a fun quip from Chris as well. Quakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. That's before Godzilla gets involved.
Yeah. Quakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, oh my.
Yep. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And sometimes those earthquakes affect tips of icebergs too.
Well, yeah, because you will get quakes will cause glaciers to spawn icebergs. And then the quakes can set up seiches, and then when the iceberg spalls off the glacier, and depending on how it happens, that can cause more wave action. So
then you have a secondary and tertiary reaction from it.
Mm-hmm. And woe betide if the quake causes an underwater landslide or a landslide into water.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually been reports of localized tsunamis caused by landslides into like fjord type areas. Mm-hmm. And there was one, I've seen one report of a guy and his son that were out fishing. This was up in Alaska, but it was a fjord type setup. And a landslide hit the water up at the head of the fjord, and their boat rode the wave.
I was going to say everything came rushing right on out. Yeah.
Yeah, and the boat rode the wave up over the trees.
Oh man.
And when they finally settled, they were on dry ground.
It's like, well, we landed here. Where is here?
Yeah, where is here? It's not the water. What do we do with our boat?
And if it's large enough, you definitely can't drag it back to water.
And I don't offhand know what size their boat was.
You know,
so
canoe, you know, that's okay. You know, yacht, not so much. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Fishing boat, you know, yeah.
Yeah, that becomes part of the property, I think, after that.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, holy moly, exactly.
Holy moly
Chris.
is appropriate at that point. Let's see. I wasn't in for everything on this. Would you like to explain some basic preparedness for earthquakes?
Well, you know, one of the reasons I liked the house we chose, the house I'm in right now, is because it has that slab foundation that will surf the quake waves. I happen to be in an area, this area is part of Dixie Alley. So we're second only to Tornado Alley for number of tornadoes in a given year. But in this part of the country, the tornadoes seem to follow tracks, and evidently have done since before the Europeans arrived, because the Indians knew not to settle in certain areas. I guess I've talked to some meteorologists. We think it's because the terrain and the topography is funneling them into channels. But it so happens that I am between two tracks. I'm also kind of under a hill. So, barring something weird happening, I should be in a pretty good spot here. If you want, and it is a wood frame home with siding rather than brick. If you want brick, make sure you've reinforced it very, very well. Make sure the walls, make sure your foundation has plenty of rebar, and that includes the walls of the foundation if you have a basement. If you can run reinforcement up through the brickwork, that would be good. And it probably needs to be some horizontal reinforcement, so that if a slab cracks away, you don't have a slab falling. You have it tied to the adjacent. And then there's chimneys are not good.
More debris.
More debris, yeah. Try to make sure, if you're building a basement type foundation, if you can root it on rock, that's good. You don't want it. You don't want it to liquefy under your foundation. Strap down the taller furniture. Having if you actually you're in a structure when an earthquake hits, find a doorway or archway in a structural wall and stand in it and hang on, because that doorway will function as an arch, which is one of the strongest architectural structures known. And if you just hang on there, the structural wall, not just a wall dividing rooms, but an actual load-bearing wall, will be the strongest and stand the best chance of remaining standing when all is said and done. So if you get in that archway of a door and hang on in a structural wall, you should make it through.
Carly asks, we live in a 3-story house with a basement stucco house that's about 100 years old. Are we screwed? If it's 100 years old, you probably have cross timber going on.
Yeah,
Cross timber is actually pretty decent in the
Mhm.
long and short.
If it's been standing for 100 years, then it's already stood through a few. Chances are you might be in good shape.
The front half of my house was built in 1923, so that's where I'm going if the big earthquake comes. This back part, built in the 80s, so not so much.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the better and the more reinforced the structure, the better off you are. All this stuff I got hanging on the wall back here behind me, that's coming down. Whenever you see the older high-rise buildings with all the falderalls on the outside, that's not structural. That's coming down. You don't want to be on the sidewalk underneath it.
What is your opinion on those earthquake-safe houses, or like those earthquake-safe beds that basically entomb you in a structure? Which makes for a great novel, too.
I'd rather be killed outright than die slowly of starvation.
That's how I feel about it, honestly. I've seen them, and it's horrifying.
Entombing is potentially a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it's literally there. I saw one literally on a video the other day, and it's a queen size bed, but it's like a 2-stack, like how they used to do them back in the day on the big platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And you literally lift up the hatch, get under the bed, and then you have like two oxygen tanks and some rations, and then a filter that goes out, and that's it. I'm like,
and
someone's spending $50,000 to kill themselves, unfortunately.
Slowly.
Yeah.
Because how are they gonna find you? How are they gonna know to look for you there?
No cell signal in there.
And worse, here's another bad thing about earthquakes, okay? Fires have a tendency to break out in the wake of earthquakes.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're under there. You can't get out because your house is falling on top of it and caught fire.
Or water's rising. So that happens too. Mains break, entire neighborhoods flood.
So yeah, I tend to be a little bit on the claustrophobic side. I'm okay if I can move around a little bit. No, that doesn't appeal to me at all. No. Just let something follow me, take me out right off. Boom. I'm okay with that.
Yep. Carl's like, we've had a good life, Carly. Love you. And then
no, Bruce... actually, Carly, I think that sounds like you're not screwed.
Yeah.
I think it sounds like if it's been around that long, it's probably got a pretty good structure to it.
It's probably something like mine that's like old-fashioned 1x4 cross timber for the walls, and then the ceiling is like another style of thatching. So it sounds great, honestly, in the long and short. And Ruth does make a really, really good point. That earthquake bed sounds like my claustrophobic nightmare.
Bingo. Mine too. I've seen the automated ones. Mm-hmm. That as soon as the shaking starts, it
sucks you in.
Yeah. And I'm
no. What happens if you get this last ditch effort of, oh my god, I got to stand up and run? It's gonna be like one of those horror movies that eats you in half.
Yeah, a library would not be a good place.
Yeah, library would not be fun. You're going to be buried in the 500 section.
Yeah,
which is I think nonfiction. So, but
food and water, a change of clothes,
bug out bag,
a bug out bag, something to cook food or heat with. Shelter from the elements, windbreak, something to keep the rain or snow off of you. Because this thing seems to like to go off at night in the wintertime.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure why. I do know, and this is a little bit interesting. everybody's familiar with tides if you live along the coast or if you've been to the coast. What most people don't realize is there are tides in the rock of the planet also.
Hmm.
And so these add stress to quake zones, fault zones. And there's a very slight, it's not huge, and the tide in the rock being generally inflexible, is not big, but it's measurable. And so there's a very slight increased probability of quakes in fault zones at high tide. One of the things that I must not have had it in this version of this talk. I thought I did. At the time that the Reelfoot Rift formed, a secondary rift tried to form, a rip in the plate, if you will. And that is known as the Southern Oklahoma Olacogen. The original plate boundary, everything from about the northern state line of Louisiana down, has been added by the Mississippi River, and was not originally part of the plate, or at least was not part of the plate at that time.
Now become a primary version of a secondary portion. Now it's like it's kind of like an offshoot.
But as the plates ripped apart at that point, I'm trying to figure out how to do this.
So it
you
splits,
had the Reelfoot Rift trying to rip like this, but then you had the Olacogen rip
like
over here,
a separate junction, like in a cave.
Think about you just grab something, a plastic wrap, and try to tear it apart, how it'll develop multiple stress planes. And so we know that it runs from the northwest corner of, I'm trying to remember here, the northwest corner of Louisiana, cuts off the corner of Texas, all across Oklahoma, and it runs over into the mountains, and may go as far as Utah.
Gotcha.
And actually, it's kind of interesting, because a lot of the earthquakes in Oklahoma that are being blamed on fracking are actually along the Olacogen. And most people don't know about the Olacogen either. So, because it's even smaller, because basically, we almost wound up with 3 separate tectonic plates, where today we only have one. Because it was trying to rip into 3 pieces. You know what, Chris? I don't offhand know. Let me see if I can do a quick search on that.
But if we would have had 3 separate plates, we wouldn't be in the state that we know it right now at all.
Right.
Because now you have 3-fold the damage, 3-fold the probability, and it would be a definite I want to live on another planet situation, probably.
Something like, yeah.
Do you know anything about exotectonic activity, like other planets?
Right now, we don't really know. I mean, we're getting some discoveries, but it's not like anything that we are used to because it's ice.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Let's see.
I guess you're right. Ice does act a lot differently than the ground that we know of.
The St. Francois Mountains were formed by volcanic and intrusive activity about 1.5 billion years ago. By comparison, the Appalachians started forming about 460 million years ago. and the Rockies a mere 140 million years ago. When the Appalachians started forming, the St. Francois Range was already twice as old as the Appalachians are today. That's not going to mean anything to y'all unless I define a whole bunch of stuff. The St. Francois Mountains were formed by igneous activity, whereas most of the surrounding Ozarks are developed on Paleozoic sedimentary rocks as a dissected plateau. Look at the Wichita orogeny. Okay, so it looks like it's a little of all of the above, Chris. The Wichita orogeny was a mountain building event, consisted of folding and faulting, and the embedded St. Francois were volcanic. Does that help?
That is interesting. That you can get a little bit of A, B, and C in this world.
Yeah, so it's kind of all. Take one from column A, one from column B, one from column C.
All right, Stephanie, we're within about 4 minutes of wrap up.
Thank you for saving me, Joe.
But of course, you know, you have something else coming up just right after that.
That's right.
Everybody's over there in the green room getting ready. So we're going to be rolling with that in just a minute. So let's go ahead and plug all your websites and all that.
Okay. I have a website, www.stephanie-osborn.com.
Right there, scrolling across the bottom of the screen.
Yep. And I have an Amazon author page. If you just go to Amazon and you type in Stephanie Osborn, you should be able to find the author page. I have books available for Kindle and Nook. And most, but not all of my books are also available in print. The popular science books are not yet available in print because they are just not big enough to be cost effective. What I'm going to do is, once I get enough out there, I'm going to gather them up into a single volume and put it in print as a single volume. So be patient on that. Meanwhile, read ebooks. I like to write science fiction with a strong hint of mystery, and I use my background to do it. So even when I'm doing, just like space opera or something, I have a tendency to sit down and work out the explanations for the gizmos and stuff like that, so that at least to my mind, I'm satisfied that it's possible.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, I still have fun with it.
It may be fictional, but it's probable.
Well, if not probable, at least possible.
Possible.
And I have fun with it. There's one series I write called the Division 1 series. It's my take on the urban legend of Men in Black. And I tell people I write that with my tongue planted so firmly in my cheek that it's poking out the side of my face. So I have a lot of fun with it. I've got, right now, I've got a trilogy in Richard Wyand's universe, the Empire series, and that's proving quite popular right now. That's a science fiction series that's, there's a lot of political, it's political maneuvering. There's military science fiction in it. And I've written the Imperial Police trilogy within that series. It kind of runs in parallel with the main line of the series. So you might want to check that out. The Empire series has a page to itself on Amazon.
Oh, okay.
Right, shutting up now.
But I'm just gonna pull you down. You can just stay in the room. I'm gonna I think if John is still in the room, or Heather, if she's watching, tell people to go ahead and start migrating over, and we'll start closing out this show, and I'm going to end your show on your channel because I don't think you want the acting part on your
It
channel.
doesn't matter. They can watch it if they want to.
If they want to watch it, okay, I will leave that one running again. I will leave that running then. That's why I'm not doing any speaking parts in this.
Well, I don't promise. I've been working on the accent and I don't have it down. So
well, it's a table read, so we'll never know. All right, I'm gonna bring my mic back up over there. Hey guys, if y'all want to start moving over, I'll see you there.
Give me a couple minutes here, and I'm going to refill my water bottle and grab me a
okay, because it's going to be because we'll start at top of the hour.
Okay,
about 4 minutes.
Okay,
all right. Let's run a few commercials real quick and get ready for this. This is going to be interesting. This is something I've been planning for a while. I look forward to it. Y'all need to hang around, stay tuned. This is going to be a table read of a classic 60s science fiction show. Due to copyright rules, we can't really say what the science fiction show is, but you'll get the hint from the start. All right, let's let's pay some bills real quick.
This is the Legend of the Traveling TARDIS. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Subscribe to us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Also catch us on the HWWS Web TV YouTube channel. Subscribe today and become part of the legend.
Hey guys, it's Angel with Immortal Impressions doing the virtual thing for HallowCon 2020. Y'all can visit us at For Immortal Impressions on Facebook. Send us a private message. We can handle all of your ceramic, sewing, 3D printing, masks, costumes, and all the other goodies that we have, and we'll be glad to take care of you. Y'all have a good con and a good year.